Hi everyone, this is a continuation from a previous video that I posted last week. I'll have the link in the description below if you want to watch that first, but it certainly isn't a requirement. So last week we started out with this color photograph on the left. I've gone through my watercolor paints and I prepared this little swatch card so that I'm not searching for colors while I'm painting. So first we have Perylene green. I plan to use this color for the darkest areas of the trees and the grass. For the lighter value, I'll likely use some of that on the field. Next is cerulean blue. Both light and dark will be used in the sky. Burnt umber for the road. I think I'll mostly be using the lighter value for this one, but maybe some of the dark in the little shadowed areas as well. A mix of burnt umber and Venetian red will also be used on the road. If you don't have Venetian red, burnt sienna should work just fine. Yellow ochre, the darker value for the patch of flowers, and the lighter value for the grass and the field. This next blue is a mix of Prussian blue and Paynes gray. I think this will be perfect for the mountains, but I also plan on dropping some into the upper sky. This is lamp black and Perylene green for the darkest parts of the tree and the road. And finally, a mix of yellow ochre and Perylene green, which I'll be using for some of the field and the trees. Now let's take a look at the value study. In the last video, we used a paint by numbers approach to put together this single color scene. This will be used as a guide for today's painting. So where you see the lightest values, these were assigned the number 1. The mid-tone values were assigned number 2, and the darkest values were our number 3s, alongside the road, the underside of the trees, and in the grass in the foreground. I'll be mentioning those assigned numbers throughout today's painting. And as I get started wetting the upper portion of my paper, I'm going to share the grayscale image from the last video. This was the photograph that we used to assess those numbers, since it's easier to determine the values without the distraction of color. I've loaded my brush with cerulean blue and plenty of water, and I'm going to start on the number 1s, leaving only the clouds white. Darker blue further up in the sky, including some of that Prussian mix. I'll use a paper towel to dab away some of the excess paint. Now I'm wetting the lower portion of my paper and preparing to lay down a wash of the lightest values, the number 1s, in the tree and field areas. I'm not letting my sky dry first because I want to welcome some degree of blending and bleeding amongst the colors. I know some of you may prefer to wet the whole page at once, and that's totally fine, but I'm so used to working on extremely small projects that an entire 8 by 10 inch page of paper is overwhelming to me. So I'll be working in sections so I don't feel pressured to get everything done before it starts to dry. I'm sure I'll get to the point where I can tackle the entire first layer in one go, but I'm just not fast enough yet. While the paper is wet, I'm dropping in those number 2 mid-tone values as well, and I'll explain my thought process. Now it's just a thought, mind you, as this will be the first time I'm putting this to the test. But I'm doing this because I want some of that blended look of wet on wet, especially in the distance and in the field, and I'm afraid if I try to paint all of the mid-tone values after the first wash is dry, the finish will come out a lot more crisp than I want. So instead, I'm tackling the number 2s in 2 separate steps. First, I'll be laying down the colors in the initial wet on wet wash like you see here. And then once I've finished, I'll wait for this layer to dry, and then I'll begin the second step at that point. What I'll do is I'll come back in and refine the number 2s, adding more detail where it's necessary. And then, once the second wash is dry, I'll add the darkest values, the number 3s, and the final details. I'm working on the first wash of the road now, and you may have noticed that I re-wet this area before bringing in my paint. Now I've bought myself some more time for this section. I was initially thinking that parts of the road would be left white, but when I looked over the color photograph again, I decided to actually go with just a very light value of burnt umber. Okay, I think that should do it for the wet on wet portion. The first wash is complete. I've let my paper dry and I'm ready for the second step with the number 2 values. Let's take another look at the value study to see which regions we need to focus on. I'm adding some of that Prussian blue and Paynes gray mix to the mountains, and I'm going to be adding some more color to the trees. Keeping in mind that I want to leave the upper right sides alone so that we're seeing the lighter values. By the way, if this is your first time here, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jamie, and on this channel, I'm working to improve my art, and I'm sharing what I learn along the way in the hopes that it will help others too. I've dried my brush somewhat so that I can rake it along the surface with that green without being too heavy-handed. And this is the mix of yellow ochre and perylene green. And we'll get some of those long blades of grass in the front there, and just a little bit on the other side. I'll start laying down the foundation for the darkest shadows of the road, and I'm going to be doing the same kind of raking technique. I like how using a dry brush effect allows some of the lighter areas to show through. I'm trying to keep my colors a little bit lighter the further back they are, and then they'll gradually get darker as they make their way into the foreground. I'm grabbing some yellow ochre for the patch of flowers, and I'll try to add a little bit of that color throughout the field. Just a touch here and a touch there. All right, now that we're done with the midtone values, the number 2s, I'm letting this dry for a moment. So I thought it would be fun to use a fan brush for the number 3s. I'll display the value study once again so we can seek out the darkest values. I really like using the fan brush for grass, leaves, and hay. It can really help create nice sporadic lines, and you can use it horizontally as well as vertically to achieve different looks. Let's zoom in here. Isn't that a fun way to add some detail? I'll do the same on the left, adding shadow underneath that patch of flowers as well. Let's see if I can use the fan on the lower sides of these trees. I'm hoping it'll create kind of a leafy look here. And I'm brushing more of that burnt umber and Venetian red mix across the road. I'm even trying to work in like some little specks here and there so it looks like dirt or maybe some pebbles. So I've added some more black to that mix of the perylene green and lamp black because I want to really take care of those final shadows and make them pop. When I'm painting grass, I do try to make sure I have little clusters and tufts of grass rather than having every blade off on its own. With some horizontal dashes, I'm going to create those little tiny cast shadows. Okay, I'm afraid it's already venturing into the realm of being overworked, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. Time for the tape reveal. My paper is a bit warped, so what I'm going to do is just give it a smush. I like to leave my paintings on a flat surface and underneath a ream of printer paper for about an hour or so. And if I do this when the paint is dry, but the paper is still in that cool, damp phase, then it flattens out really nicely. But if I try to do it after it's entirely dry, the results aren't as good. So I'll just be back once it's flat. All right, much better. Now let's evaluate. So first, looking at the final painting next to the black and white image, I would say I was able to stay pretty much on track with my values, so that's a plus. And here it is next to the value study. And finally, let's compare it to the reference photo. I can see where I missed out on that negative space in between the tree branches. If I'd captured that better, we'd be able to get more of a contrast with the light versus dark shadows in this area. And I probably could have gone with more saturation with my colors, but I don't try for realism, so I'm not really that bothered by the toned down, muted version. I'm actually quite excited to experiment more with this method, especially the way we touched in those mid-tone values in the wet on wet wash, and then we refined them in the next layer. So what do you think? Was the paint by numbers approach an easier way to look at values? Let me know in the comments if you gave this a try. Thanks so much for watching.